I think they're starting to feel that there is a crisis in their legitimate authority, and so they have to respond to the kind of broader rights claims that are being made from the more diverse communities that have entered into the discussion about what peace building and state building, conflict resolution and mediation should entail. So they feel under a lot of pressure. But as ever, there are different spectrums of response to this. And I think there's a conservative position, which is that this is futile. We need to stick to the basics, security and some strong institutions, and at least making conflict-affected environments open to global capital. And that's really the best we can do. And we shouldn't really get into the other issues which relate to deeper forms of rights, historical and distributive justice, and so on, because these issues involve you becoming involved much more deeply in societal and political issues, and that's risky. They feel that risks their credibility and legitimacy. So if they just focus on the kind of minimalist aspects of security, within the kind of confines of a more neoliberal oriented peace, they feel like they have more chances of success. On the kind of broader scheme of things, where people have been pushing in the institutions for a much more wide-ranging response, for example, from UNDP and some of the, let's say, the good donors like the Norwegians and the Swedes and so on, there is a counter-argument that these very narrow conceptions of peace are self-undermining. And so if we don't get involved with gender issues, we don't get involved with identity issues, with the broader questions of justice, the state itself, which has become the kind of the solution, the cipher for a solution in conflict-affected environments, will never survive without being a kind of trusteeship-style state. So they would counter and say that this very sort of conservative retreat within the liberal peace framework, and a very sort of 19th century version of that, is contradictory and actually just leads to more trusteeship, more intervention, more conflict, more structural violence. And so we need to roll out more strategies, more programs, build awareness, invest more, and so on, in a broader understanding of peace, which takes us away from this liberal narrative and into kind of entwined notions which connect to local history and culture, to geopolitics and the power structures in situ, as well as regional questions, and then global normative, cosmopolitan discussions about human rights and long-term sustainability, now also connecting with issues of the environment and how the global economy needs to be reformed, and so on. So you can see pluses and minuses in both positions. That very narrow version of the liberal peace is minimalistic, reductionist, parsimonious, and possibly achievable if you don't overlook this glaring contradiction between capital and political rights. The very broad version seems ambitious and somewhat idealistic, and sort of drives you down the path of perhaps some form of tighter global governance, world federation, these sorts of things, in order to achieve it, because it's such a big project. And even so, we don't really yet have global agreement on what the normative values would be that could be applied more broadly. We only again have a very narrow agreement there. So both sides have plus points and negative points. And the institutions are torn between these two positions. A lot of them feel that they are actually on the kind of conservative position, becoming quite moribund, and the claims that are being made against them, and I see this particularly in the UN, DPKO, to a large extent at the moment, are claims that they have to respond to. So they have to respond to local rights claims, local identity claims, historical claims, these sorts of things that are emerging in this more knowledgeable and technological age. And if they don't do that, they'll lose their legitimate authority and they'll lose their capacity to intervene, and if they do lose those things, then there'll be no peacemaking, no peace building, no development, and so on. So they're under great pressure and they feel pretty stressed about it. So you can understand why other colleagues are saying, well, look, this is too ambitious. Just stay within this narrow remit, otherwise in the end you'll damage the architecture itself. Personally, I think that the narrow version has had its day. This sort of liberal peace moving into a neoliberal architecture it's now, I think, widely discredited, and the tide is turning against it in the institutions, but there's very little political will to explore materially or epistemologically this broader framework. A lot of, I think, the interest in the global south in peacekeeping and peacebuilding recently from the global north has been a kind of cipher for saying, help us answer these questions, help us respond to these questions, do something about it, because we can't do it, and we probably have no intention of doing it because it contradicts many of the kind of political positions and the ideological positions that have been taken in the global north. So there's this unpacking going, this sense of crisis, this loss of legitimacy, but also this sense that we need to retain the institutions, we need to retain the capacity to intervene, the programs need to be expanded. And you can also see a kind of generational shift along those lines within the institutions too, where younger appointees have this broader perspective. They're thinking in terms of slightly more idealistically and slightly more longer term perspectives, I guess, too. And the people who have been charged with maintaining and saving the institutions during the Cold War and then marginally expanded them since are pretty concerned that that's overextension and risky in other ways. So sort of swings and roundabouts at the moment. I know that in some of the UN institutions they are sort of actively looking for fresh ideas and they're strongly feeling the crisis of legitimacy. And one of the things that they are doing is bringing in a lot of local knowledge from conflict-affected areas and putting them right at the high tables in the committees and all the rest of it, so that they feel that there are some authoritative voices, at least, available to them when they discuss Syria or Libya or wherever it might be. But with a very powerful caveat that a lot of their colleagues also feel that just bringing in a few people from conflict-affected societies doesn't do justice to the full dynamics of the politics of those places, and therefore risks partisan approaches being developed and bias and so on and so forth too. So between a rock and a hard place, progress is, if there is any progress, extremely slow. I think one of the more positive things, I think there is a sense that although the institutions have faced all of these problems, we can't do without them. That's why they're under such great pressure, because they need to survive. If there had been a moment where people could think, oh well, the UN's no longer needed, the donor system's no longer needed, even foreign policy itself is now irrelevant in this neoliberal technocratic age, then they wouldn't feel the pressure, they would just fade away, they would just dissolve. But actually I think they see the contradictions and they see the need for micro-level engagements as well as the more structural level engagements to respond to them. I mean, I think there's a bit of a divergence in the way we understand the evolution of international mediation at the moment. The kinds of mediation that we saw from the 1970s to the 1990s, I don't think is really with us anymore. It exists on paper and in occasional attempts that we saw, for example, in Syria and in Libya. But these aren't, they don't really fit well with the kind of peace building, state building, the much grander scale ethos of state engineering that we adopted, the international community tried to adopt in the 2000s. So although I think on paper there seems to be this expanding interest in international mediation, as it was narrowly defined, I think actually what we have in reality is an expanded form of international mediation, which has somehow slipped under the radar and hasn't a great presence in the kind of epistemological framing of interventionary practices yet. So mediation has shifted from this sort of narrowly defined diplomatic activity which is aimed at state-to-state relations or constitutional frameworks to something which is now much more local to global. It's much more networked, it's much more about teams, coordination of different actors, addressing different aspects and levels of war and conflict. And I mean, so far I'm not sure how coordinated that is. I'm not sure how it's kind of shimmering on the intellectual horizon, but I don't think we've really accurately come to terms with what it means. You can see some evidence of this in UN documentation and EU documentation, where they are talking about the expansion of mediation, the kind of teams and strategies and issues that are being addressed. But that to me looks very much like peace building. And not so much like this kind of notion of 19th century mediation where statesmen stand up and hammer out constitutional agreements or peace agreements between states, which deal with the security issues and then seem to exist forevermore. So I think that idea of mediation as something beholden to diplomatic culture and state centricity is less and less relevant. The idea of mediation as mediating within and between the many different structural, identity and political forces that lead to conflict, I think is increasingly important. And what peace building and state building as conceptual and policy practices didn't do was understand that they were mediating forces. They thought they were reformist and transformatory forces. And as they were enacted in those various cases around the world, from Cambodia to Bosnia to Kosovo to Timor, and then sort of on into the aberrations of Afghanistan and Iraq and kind of the withdrawals of Libya and Syria, there was this sense that there was nothing to mediate except the emplacement of a kind of already functioning programmatic framework of the new state over a conflict environment. And so the role was to build something. It wasn't to mediate forces. It was just simply to eradicate the forces and to build a new structure on kind of this terra incognito below. So that's failed, I would say. I mean, all of the contemporary empirical evidence tends to show that there are social forces, there are political forces, there are economic forces, all kinds of things competing for attention. This is what makes the state. This is what makes regional politics. Some of it's global, some of it's transversal, some of it's transnational, some of it's very local. And it's in that reality that one has to make peace, and that involves all kinds of strategies and institutional approaches to mediation, to mediate those various and entwined and often contradictory forces. So the kind of stabilization language that began to emerge after the Iraq intervention and sort of around the Arab revolts seems to me to be a partial realization that there are these forces and there are these political claims that are being made. That's why there are conflicts. And quite often these political claims and forces are not just local, they're not just related to civil war or even cross-border war, but they're related to global flows and global issues, or regional flows and regional issues. So one has to start to mediate these different forces. And this is where mediation comes back into its own. But that sort of 19th century diplomatic notion of mediation is only really a kind of image or symbol for 21st century mediation, which is going to be much more complex, connecting personal relations with the revision of the state, with questions about global capital and regional and international political architectures, with rights claims as they expand, with structural forces, geopolitical forces, geoeconomic forces, and so on. And these are the things that need to be mediated. So institutions like the UN and the many agencies around the UN, or the IFIs, they're able to mediate different claims within these parameters. But there's probably going to be a need to create new institutions to deal with the moving into view of a whole range of other issues which we now know contribute to conflicts, whether they're historical, distributive, questions of justice, resource issues, environmental issues, and so on, which aren't really part of the framework of addressing conflict that we have so far. So moving towards building a state began to help us understand that we needed to take a much more holistic view of conflict. And what the state could do was open up the tools of policymakers and the instruments and the institutions, the legal frameworks and so on, in order to be sort of redesigned and transformed. But now we've actually realized that that's a very 19th century perspective of war and conflict and violence, because the dynamics in which conflict is nested are global and regional, as well as very local and sort of micro-political. And so we need new institutions, new architectures to add to these layers. One of the problems that we've seen, though, in the last 25 years, as new institutions and new architectures have developed to address different aspects of conflicts, they've also replicated the tensions within those conflicts amongst themselves. So competition for space, for example, between, let's say, UNDP and the Peacebuilding Commission and the IMF and the World Bank, just been one very obvious example. This isn't a comfortable relationship. amongst those institutions. And I'd expect more of that to emerge. Well, I guess my first response would be related to the kind of epistemological framing of mediation and peacebuilding and peacekeeping and all of these practices, which really were designed in very specific circumstances, in particular times and particular places. And from the late 1950s onwards, the game, if you like, has been to take these tools, turn them into bureaucratic tools so they can be programmed and passed around the world. And we've ended up with this whole set of tools, which are kind of one-size-fits-all tools, many of which are designed for European or post-colonial conflicts, which were then applied to conflicts that emerged from the collapse of socialism and communism, and then the sort of so-called new wars, and so on. So clearly there's a limitation, a kind of an epistemological limitation to the way in which those tools are carried around the world by individuals and institutions, as if they were sui generis and conflicts themselves were all the same. So this is something which I think everybody recognises is implausible, and help is required, if not direction. So I guess one of the big questions is how would the scholars around GSUM and the policymakers, with their own specific experiences, think about tools and strategies for conflict? How would they identify what causes conflict, and how would they themselves respond? And how is this different to the international peace architecture that we currently are operating with? And I think tensions and certainly discussions within those parameters are emerging all over the world. It's not just GSUM, but there's been a kind of proliferation of institutes in university or policy settings in the global south, all over the world, in which these sorts of conversations are taking place. Quite often they start from a critique of the liberal peace architecture, what's wrong with it, and then pretty soon they start to engineer kind of more original responses, more original tools. Part of the problem is, of course, that the material resources for intervention don't lie in the global south, at the moment at least. So a lot of this is intellectual, and the next point is to try and insert it into that global discussion, which is often happening in rather Eurocentric or Northern-centric venues, which is another tricky thing to do. So these are two things which I think, an intervention in the conceptual theoretical discussions, and then finding ways of communicating that into the kind of metropolitan institutions up there in the global north that think that this is their project, and making clear that it's actually a global project.